Welcome to the Spartan Tailgate 24/7 Sports Recruiting Day Special. Jack Ebling here with Dan Kilbridge and Sean Scherer, our recruiting expert. Dan, as you hear Mark Dantonio talk about this class and say it might be the best ever, most recruiting analysts wouldn't say that.
No, because it doesn't have maybe the flash or the bells and whistles of some of those other classes they've had the past 2 years, getting multiple playmakers. And so Dantonio maybe doesn't agree with the recruiting services there. I think that would be consistent across college football. You get coaches who don't agree with those recruiting services. But I think overall he was right that this is a very balanced class and addressed a lot of needs, which is something he pointed out.
Maybe a little better than people think because they were able to get the 6 defensive linemen, 4 secondary players, 3 or 4 offensive linemen, depending on if you want to count the preferred walk-on. So that could be 14 of the 21 or 22 players right there in that group.
Well, what I like about this class the most is first and foremost the 6 defensive linemen. I mean, it's an issue that, needed to be addressed with only taking, 2 defensive linemen and, 3 maybe of last year's class. So them to able to get 6 solid defensive linemen will definitely, pay dividends down the road.
And that could be even more valuable if Blake Treadwell becomes a center, and they're certainly looking at that right now. If that happens, it's going to create another opportunity for someone to step in and play quickly. But in terms of the way Michigan State recruits and the fact that they were able to have 16 guys committed by the fall, they got 4 in January, and they get 1 here on February 2nd. But the way that Michigan State recruits a little bit different from some other schools in terms of the kind of approach Mark Dantonio takes. It's a very low pressure pitch.
Yeah, and you see them get in on a lot of kids early that way, and they don't pressure you like some other coaches will and give deadlines and ultimatums and that sort of thing. Dantonio first and foremost wants to make sure that Michigan State is a place that the recruit wants to be, and he's going to make sure that that's a point of emphasis in the meeting. And also, when you're ready, you can become a Spartan. If not, we'll see you on the field someday maybe. And I think that's a refreshing approach in this day and age with some of the tactics you see out on the recruiting trail. I think it speaks to the program, and also maybe you do miss out on some of the flashy recruits that way. You might miss out on a top kid without the hard sell and without the promises and things of that nature, which I'm told aren't delivered that often as far as playing time, things like that. But I think overall it's a solid approach, and you've seen it build depth the past 3 or 4 years by the way they recruit and kind of zoning in on the guys they want early.
Michigan State, whatever the approach, has been able to get the #1 ranked player in the state of Michigan the last 2 years with William Golston and now Lawrence Thomas. And when you look at the way this staff does its business, Sean, you have seen this staff closer than we have. The fact that they don't pressure guys maybe results in the fact they don't get as many decommitments, they don't get as many transfers. When guys are here, they tend to know what they're getting. They want to be here.
Well, Coach Dantonio and his staff builds relationships. I mean, he starts, at the high school level, making sure that he makes that relationship with the high school coach and also the position coaches at the high school. And then with those relationships, that stems down to, the families, the athletic directors, the principals. They make sure that they know if they're after someone that they want that player or that prospect to be part of their program. And this is the reason why is their consistency of showing up to basketball games, track events,
right.
Anything that they're allowed to,
right.
Within the NCAA guidelines, to make sure that they can show to that recruit that they want them to
it's
be
a family. We see that here, and Michigan State has always started in the state of Michigan, maybe Ohio, or the very close surrounding states. But this year, 12 states: California, Texas, Florida, New Mexico. What does that say, Dan, about the approach and maybe what kind of year it was in the state of Michigan?
I think like Sean was saying, going back to those relationships, I think it shows that the staff is starting to branch out with those relationships. And when they first got here, Michigan was the primary recruiting area, and that's what they focused on. And then as the wins pile up and you build those relationships, you branch out to a Wisconsin or a New Mexico, even like we saw this year. So I think that's an important next step, and it's something you certainly need to do if you want to compete at the next level and consistently play for championships in the Big Ten. And I think it's important that they were able to go into a state like Wisconsin, where they haven't been for a decade, or a state like Florida, and get a receiver, Jawan Caesar, and really do some things outside of the state of Michigan while also doing a great job in the Detroit area.
The Detroit area, one reason they've been able to succeed is, you know, they landed Chris Norman so early, you know, part of the 2008 recruiting class. And then for, you know, the next year after that, you know, you also get Dana Dixon, you know, in that class of Chris. And then you also add Mylon Hicks last year, and then you get Lawrence Thomas this year, and then you also have a 2012 prospect out there right now, Jabari Dean, you know, who's going to be one of the, you know, up-and-coming guys in the 2012 class. So I think it's that consistency of them being like, we recruit Detroit Renaissance, we want this to be a pipeline to Michigan State. You know, Dantonio made a point today about, you know, getting a player out of Detroit Southeastern again this year. You know,
right.
Last year they got
build relationships, and we see how that works, and it works all over the country. And certain schools have pipelines to certain states. Sometimes those can be tough to break. Michigan State saw that this year again with Glenville out of Ohio. But I think in Michigan State's case, you look at the way that they recruit, and they try to get commitments early from guys that they believe in. They really don't care what the scouting services say. They're not recruiting based on stars, and they don't care exactly when they get the players, as long as they get the players they wanted. I think once again we see that Michigan State maybe didn't get all the players they wanted, but they wanted all the players they got. And it wasn't a matter of them scrambling at the last minute, and I've seen that here before, where Michigan State would take a lot of two-star guys or guys who maybe didn't have all the things they were looking for, but they had to fill. There's no filling here, not when you have 16 out of 21 before you really get into the winter recruiting season.
Yeah, and as you touched on, it's not like they're going out there and signing 45 guys to a class. They're going to make sure that they have the appropriate amount of guys on scholarship and make sure that they do want every guy that's coming there, like you mentioned. I think that's very important. And, you know, when you look at the way the SEC does some of those things, it's a little different with Dantonio and his staff. As far as the way they recruit those guys. And also, like you mentioned, I think they want guys who are going to fill their system, and they've been together for so long that they have a type of player in mind of who's going to work with what they do, who they can mold, who maybe they couldn't change even if he appears to be a top-rated prospect, and I think that's worked out very well for them.
Michigan State able to get 3 high school All-Americans and a junior college All-American, as Mark Dantonio said in the comments he just made across the street. Looking at this class, Sean, very quickly, can you give us your top 3 prospects here and maybe a surprise player?
Number 1, I think, is Donovan Clark. I think he just is flown underneath the radar. I think he's an offensive lineman that can come in and make an impact. Just getting, you know, talking with him, his dedication to football and his dedication to being part of a program. I feel Donovan Clark is going to come in here and, you know, be a difference maker. I think a player that, you know, will definitely make an impact next year will be Lawrence Thomas. I mean, obviously, you see his frame. I mean, he's 6'4½", 242 pounds. He has the ability to play middle linebacker with that frame.
Give us one more.
There's so many of them. I would have to say Elijah Miller. Just seeing his explosiveness, you know, he rushed for, you know, 27 touchdowns as a junior, 33 touchdowns, and just the adversity he went through this past year, impact, I see Elijah Miller being one name to remember out of this class.
Elijah Miller, the last letter that was faxed, actually had to be faxed from campus. Sexton coach Dan Bogan was here to deliver it by hand, found out he had to go somewhere else and fax it. It's the way the NCAA works. What was the hang-up with that, Sean?
The hang-up with that was Elijah's mom. You could kind of sense that, you know, she wanted him to get out of the Lansing area and maybe pursue a different college outside of, you know, the greater Lansing area, Michigan area, and go down south. When Elijah committed back to Michigan State last spring, when we broke that story, Elijah clearly wanted to be part of Michigan State, and since then, he's never steered away from that. But that's also the way Dantonio recruits, right, is he wants to make sure that he has the security from, you know, the family, that is this the decision that he is making. Because this isn't, when he signs his name on the dotted line, I mean, it's a done deal. And it's a done deal now, and, you know, I think...
Well, he was an outstanding running back, no question about that, but he's recruited as an athlete. It looks like they're going to start on the defensive side of the ball at safety. We'll see where that takes him. But if there are any concerns about a local kid staying home, and I've seen that work and I've seen it not work, but in the case of a guy from Lansing Sexton, I have 2 words for Mrs. Miller. Alan Haller. who's here on staff, and if there's any concerns, that's a guy who can help her son adjust to whatever he may run into here. Dan, in terms of the names on this list, the video you have seen, the players you've talked to, is there one that stands out to you as one to watch?
I really like this Jack Ebling kid. I mean, he's a center, big, nasty offensive lineman. He's a wrestler, too. Mark Dantonio said he believes he's 36-0 on the season. They've seen him wrestle. Coach Mark Staten, the offensive line coach newly appointed, said that every once in a while in their winter workout conditioning programs, they do a little grappling with the guys.
Right,
and he thinks Jack might scare a few guys in that next year, and maybe even has the talent to wrestle at State if he wanted to. But I think he's going to be a guy who can come in. Michigan State's not completely set at the center position right now. Still a few names up in the air. Nate Klatt, Ethan Rulin could compete for the job, but Jack Ebling is my guy to watch for the next couple of years here.
Yeah, and after listening to Mark Dantonio, I wasn't sure if Michigan State was getting Jack Allen or John Cena. The way that he talked about his wrestling ability, absolutely amazing. I guess still undefeated this year in Hinsdale, Illinois. But the player who stood out to me, and Sean, you introduced me to him last summer, was Tawan Jones. And after looking at some of that YouTube video, and not just his football stuff, which is eye-popping in itself, but whenever you see a guy who can jump out of a swimming pool with 3 feet of water, jump backwards and land up on the deck, or to jump from 2 feet flat on cement and jump on top of a 5-foot garbage bin, this guy's got some explosiveness and the kind of athleticism that would make him, initially, you've got to think, a tremendous special teams athlete.
Yeah, and he's played a multitude of positions. I mean, he's been all over the field, as I'm sure Sean can explain further. I mean, he's just a guy that's been all over and certainly put up some big numbers, sort of flying under the radar there for a while.
Taiwan is so young. I mean, he's not even going to be, grown into his frame when he arrives at campus, this summer. So he has the option to redshirt, just as Mylan Hicks did this past year, which will, benefit Mylan, 120% down the road, having that extra year underneath him. But first time I saw Taiwan was when he was going up against Lawrence Thomas one-on-one in a drill, and Taiwan did a little shake and bake and left LT in his shoes. And I was like, if you're going to leave LT in your shoes, you're going to be a special player.
He might be a guy you'd want in the Superstars competition. When you look at a class like this, there are certainly some needs on this team. We talk about left tackle and how nice it would have been to have Folfinote here for spring practice. That's not going to happen. Arjun Pokun is going to be here right away, but I think he's the only player in this group.
He's the only one that early enrolled, and when I first saw Arjun, it was at Sound Mind, Sound Body. He blew every single kid in the 40-yard dash off the line. They moved it back to the 60-yard dash, and he blew every kid off the line. The kid can flat out run. He's a playmaker. He knows how to play football, and he has a chip on his shoulder. He feels just because he's from Canada that he can play with any kid on that field, no matter who it is, and he's a competitor, and he's going to make an impact, and he will make an impact next year.
I have never heard a head football coach on signing day say, well, we just didn't do a very good job. I wish we had a better class. The first one who does, I'm going to buy him dinner. But once again, Mark Dantonio talking about how this all fits into the big picture, the infrastructure paying off, talked about it being an outstanding class, regardless of what anyone else may say. And in talking about these players, he used the word great at least 24 times. Dan, I want you to summarize this recruiting class in one word.
Go with balance. As I said before, balance. I think they address positions of need, got enough guys in here. Maybe not a top 3 class in the Big Ten or one of the best classes in the nation, but balanced class that really did the job for MSU this year.
Sean, final thoughts on this class and what it sets up for recruiting down the road in terms of some of the changes, some of the relationships that have been built here, Michigan State fanning out more around the country?
Well, what I feel is this is the most complete class Dantonio's been able to recruit. I mean, top to bottom. I mean, look at, as these players progress over the next 4 or 5 years, they're going to be able to replace what Dantonio put in place last year, the 2010 class and 2009 class. It's a very complete class, and I feel one player that we did not touch on that we should is Juwan Caesar, because now Dantonio has a 6'4" wide receiver in his arsenal, and that's something that he hasn't had here yet, and I feel Juwan Caesar is going to be selling jerseys next season.
Very interesting too, because he was one of the guys who was not at camp. came to their attention very late in the process, and that was something I think that they were able to seize on a relationship, build on that, and get a player who has his best football certainly ahead of him. We will be talking much more Michigan State football before spring practice begins. We had a chance to talk with new offensive coordinator Dan Roshar. We have Mark Staten now handling the offensive line duties, and Brad Salem, recruiting coordinator now, so some juggling of responsibilities. It looks like it's going to be a very interesting offseason, and after an 11-2 campaign, more interest in Michigan State football than I can remember in a long time. We'll be back to talk about that much more through the course of this winter. Jack Ebling here with Dan Kilbridge and Sean Scherer for 24/7 Sports and Spartan Tailgate.